Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into a truly incredible set of source documents known as the Wrong Guy's Memoirs. Our protagonist here is a guy named Gerald Slight. Now, Gerald is immortal. He has absolutely no idea why, but for the last 4,217 years, he's been sitting quietly in the back of the room for literally every major event in human civilization. We're talking everything from the construction of the pyramids all the way to the launch of the iPhone. Gerald was there for all of it. But he wasn't the one calling the shots. No, he was usually the guy holding a mop, clutching a clipboard, or desperately trying to find a spare power outlet. Okay, let's dive into this, because Gerald's central thesis is just brilliant. He says, I'm just the guy who's been refilling the coffee urns since the Bronze Age. You know, we've all been taught since grade school that history is shaped by great men and visionary ideas. But Gerald's firsthand accounts, they reveal a completely different reality. History is actually shaped by the support staff. It's the exhausted, underpaid people desperately trying to keep the great visionaries from accidentally destroying the whole shebang. And Gerald's resume is absolutely mind-boggling in its sheer, absurd scale. Just imagine this. It's 2200 BCE, and he's getting screamed at over a torn grain sack in the Akkadian Empire. Fast forward, and by 1215 CE, he is having a full-blown panic attack over ink supplies at the signing of the Magna Carta. Leap forward again to 1945, and he's practically begging the most brilliant physicists on the planet at Los Alamos to just please observe basic radiation safety. The technology changes drastically over the millennia, for sure, but as Gerald so painfully points out, human nature and bureaucratic nightmares never, ever do. To survive eternity without losing his mind, Gerald developed a very specific set of survival rules. I want to highlight rule number 4. Keep receipts. Actually, this entire memoir only exists because Gerald meticulously held onto his invoices, his shipping manifests, and his HR warnings over the centuries. And then we have rule number 5, which is honestly the most critical. Never work for a visionary. Because according to Gerald's very bitter experience, visionaries do not care about building codes, they don't care about standard logistics, and they certainly don't care about your lunch break.
Which brings us to Section 1, Managing the Visionaries. 4 arc minutes. That is the jaw-dropping precision of how the Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned to true north. Historians today marvel at this incredible feat of ancient engineering. But Gerald? Well, he was working the docks during construction, and he notes that this extreme precision wasn't originally the plan. The architect, Hemiunu, was aiming for, pretty good. But then Pharaoh Khufu got involved. We've all had that micromanager boss who changes the scope of a project at the very last minute, right? Khufu demanded absolute perfection. That pivot turned a massive but manageable project into a total logistical nightmare, resulting in completely exhausted workers frantically racing against the flooding of the Nile.
And that intense perfectionism, it trickled down to every single level. 3 finger widths. That is exactly how far off square a particular limestone block was. Gerald had to coordinate moving these 2.5-ton blocks, and he vividly remembers Hemiunu rejecting this specific stone. Now, keeping the grand scale in perspective, the punchline here is that this block was meant for the internal fill of the pyramid. Literally no one would ever see it for the rest of human history. But Hemiunu sent it back anyway, screaming at the top of his lungs that they were building for eternity. Stories like this completely shatter our romanticized view of innovation. Like, in 1450, Gerald took a job with Johannes Gutenberg. The myth we're all sold is that being present for the birth of the information age was this magical, transcendent experience. The reality? Gerald spent 2 incredibly tedious years covered in thick oil-based ink, just constantly adjusting a modified wine press. He distinctly recalls having to recast 1 tiny metal ampersand 8 separate times simply because Gutenberg kept insisting the letter looked drunk. Or think about the Sistine Chapel. We always picture Michelangelo painting up there in a state of divine, peaceful inspiration. But Gerald was the poor guy hired by the Vatican to actually build and maintain the scaffolding. And Michelangelo was deeply paranoid. He would constantly yell down at Gerald, "If I fall and die, it's your fault." He was utterly convinced the perfectly safe, securely wall-braced scaffold was going to collapse at any moment. To Gerald, this historic artistic genius basically just looked like a constantly complaining, incredibly anxious coworker who just couldn't handle heights. Moving on to Section 2, Supply Chain Disasters. We've all seen Leonardo da Vinci's famous painting of the Last Supper. Artists always depict all 13 men sitting awkwardly on one side of a really long table. Well, Gerald was actually working front of house at the inn that night in Jerusalem. he reveals that seating 13 guys on one side wasn't some profound, deeply symbolic choice. No, it was a profoundly stupid logistical decision by his boss, an innkeeper named Tobias, who just thought it would look impressive. For Gerald, it just meant that trying to serve wine over people's shoulders was an absolute elbow-bumping nightmare all night long. Then we have the brutal winter of 1777 at Valley Forge. Gerald was the supply coordinator for the Continental Army, and his weekly reports to Congress were just unbelievably bleak. Flour, insufficient. Meat, insufficient. Morale, insufficient. Guys were literally wrapping their feet in rags and eating flour mixed with dirty water. Gerald makes a great point here. The Continental Army didn't survive that freezing winter because of some grand, glowing sense of national destiny. No, they survived on pure, stubborn human spite, simply refusing to give the British the satisfaction of watching them freeze to death. Honestly, supply chain misery is a tale as old as time. Consider Gerald's agonizing 8-month stint catering the Trojan War. He's dealing with 100,000 extremely bored soldiers. Meanwhile, Achilles, the Greeks' absolute best warrior, is sulking in his tent, flat out refusing to fight, but still demanding full premium rations for his men. Because of these petty internal politics, Gerald had to cut rations across the board, leaving everyone else to eat weevil-infested grain. Gerald dryly notes that the famous Trojan horse only worked because the Trojans were simply too exhausted and desperate for the siege to end to notice the giant, obvious red flags. And sometimes the razor-thin line between historical success and complete supply failure comes down to a single hour. In 1215, at the signing of the Magna Carta, Gerald was the stationary assistant. Because nobody could agree on exactly how many copies of the document to make, the scribes had to work triple shifts, and they blew completely through the ink supply. Picture the panic. With just 60 minutes left before King John was scheduled to sit down and sign one of the most important documents in human history, Gerald literally had to sprint 2 miles to a nearby monastery just to beg for oak galls to make a fresh batch of iron gall ink. Which leads us directly into Section 3, the hubris of progress. So, the crucial point we have to ask ourselves here is this. What happens when confidence outpaces reality? Throughout history, Gerald has watched genuine experts get completely ignored in favor of sheer stubborn confidence, often with absolutely catastrophic, heartbreaking consequences. Take Christopher Columbus. Back in 1492, Gerald signed on to the Santa Maria solely because he was broke and needed the gig. But Columbus's math was terribly, fatally wrong. He calculated that Asia was just 3,700 miles away. The reality? It's more like 12,000 miles. Every navigator, every expert told him he was way off, but his unshakable confidence won out. Gerald ended up spending 10 miserable weeks pumping the ship's leaky bilge in the pitch dark, watching the crew nearly mutiny from scurvy and starvation before they accidentally stumbled onto a continent Columbus never even admitted wasn't Asia. That same devastating hubris reared its ugly head again in 1912. Gerald was working as an assistant engineer on the Titanic, calling the ship unsinkable just because it was designed to survive 4 breached, watertight compartments. That was pure marketing, not actual engineering. When the iceberg breached 6 compartments, 2 more than the math allowed for, Gerald watched the senior engineers fight a chilling, completely losing battle in the freezing, flooding engine room. They stayed behind just to keep the lights on so people topside could evacuate. And mistakes only got higher. In 1943, Gerald took a job as a safety compliance observer at Los Alamos for the Manhattan Project. The escalation of risk here is just terrifying. The brilliant minds building the atomic bomb treated basic safety protocols as mere bureaucratic obstacles. When Gerald demanded proper radiation shielding, they told him they were trying to win a war. He literally had to stand there and watch scientists manipulate the highly radioactive core of a nuclear weapon by hand, using a standard flathead screwdriver, simply because they felt safety mechanisms took too much time. And sometimes that hubris destroys the past rather than the future. In 48 BCE, Gerald was the night janitor at the Library of Alexandria. Julius Caesar, executing what he thought was a brilliant tactical, political maneuver, set fire to the harbor. Well, the fire spread wildly out of control and burned down a massive intake warehouse. It contained 40,000 uncatalogued scrolls. It erased knowledge we didn't even know we had, leaving the head librarian Titus to lament, "We don't even know what we lost." Let's move to our final part, Section 4, History's Unsung Heroes. Gerald's memoirs dedicate incredible space to honoring the brutal, unrecognized sacrifices of the working class. We're talking about the street cleaners hauling bodies during the 1348 Black Death in London while everyone else fled, the exhausted, terrified child loom operators maintaining deafening machinery in 1819 Manchester, The Trench Logistics Corps coordinating supplies at the Somme in 1916 under constant heavy artillery fire. These are the people who literally carried the heavy, bloody weight of history, yet they rarely, if ever, make it into the glossy pages of our textbooks. And this brilliantly illustrates Gerald's entire worldview. On one side, we have the traditional great man theory, right? The marble busts, the sweeping speeches, the bold ideas. But on the other side is Gerald's corrective history. It argues that those bold ideas go absolutely nowhere if the support staff doesn't figure out the logistics. History, at its very core, is shaped by whoever remembered to order enough chairs. As we march forward into the future, inventing dizzying new technologies and facing massive global crises, we really love to focus on the grand narratives of progress. But behind the scenes, there's always someone with a clipboard. So ask yourself, the next time humanity faces an era-defining moment, will we actually have the right permits for it? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this changes how you look at the history books.